only took about half a decade, but here we are, the conclusion, at least in theory, to the Destroyer Development mini-series. When we left off, World War II was about to start, the treaty system had collapsed, and any generally common themes across destroyer design had well and truly been disposed of. Some navies had been building non-treaty compliant destroyers for quite a while, or had never built to the latest treaty specs in the first place. Others had been relatively quick off the mark in adapting their designs, and still others had been laying down more or less treaty-compliant ships. Of course, it has to be borne in mind that the full implications of the collapse of the naval treaty limitations had only really begun in the mid-1930s, and some nations had still tried to hold on to at least some of those restrictions for a short time afterwards, partially in the vain hope that others would follow their example, and more on the political side of things than practical, simply because smaller destroyers were cheaper. Plus, with World War II breaking out in 1939, and the time it takes to design, develop and order even a destroyer in peacetime conditions, even when your nation is perhaps rapidly rearming, some designs were indeed being prepared in the latter part of the 1930s, but the keel plates would only actually hit the slipways after the shooting started. As we will see, the war had three primary effects on destroyer design. In some places, it curtailed further development almost completely, either because efforts were redirected to mass-producing designs that the Navy already had, or because circumstances flat-out prevented the construction of new ships, even if designs for them existed. As such, in this video, we will briefly comment on some of those never-were designs, albeit again briefly. In other places, although new designs would actually be built, their nature would reflect the need for large numbers of hulls as opposed to gold-plating ultimate designs. And finally, what new designs did hit the water would end up reflecting the rapidly evolving nature of war. The destroyer of 1939 and the destroyer of 1945 would be incredibly different vessels. As with the previous videos, we'll be covering only the destroyers of the major navies. While there are a large number of destroyers built by or for various smaller navies, those really need their own videos since the financial, design, and in some cases geographical and terrain constraints imposed on said smaller navies mean that the design and development paths of their destroyers are often wildly different to the larger navies. So we'll start with navies whose destroyer development for various reasons didn't really amount to all that much, and then gradually expand from there. This, of course, means we're starting with France. We left them building the Mogador-class contre-torpilleur and the Le Hardy-class torpilleur. A good chunk of the late 1930s had seen the Marine Nationale not actually building or designing much at all in the way of new destroyer designs, but the increased prevalence and occasional lethality of air attacks in the Spanish Civil War meant that the Marine Nationale radically changed its ideas on what made a good destroyer. The Le Hardy's only real anti-aircraft defence was a single twin 37mm installation, but now it was decided that destroyers would need much greater anti-aircraft suites, in particular dual-purpose main guns. The original 8-ship build program had been expanded to 12, and although the first batch were already far too far into construction, it was felt that the 4 additional ships might be able to have their designs modified. They'd still have to use the 130mm gun, but they might be able to use the dual-purpose mounts for the gun that had been used in the Dunkirk-class battleships if they could be adapted for destroyer use. The existing destroyer mounts could only elevate to 30 degrees. However, on top of the additional weight of the mountings, the Marine Nationale had also concluded larger magazines would be needed to accommodate a decent amount of anti-aircraft shells without overly compromising the provision of more conventional rounds to throw at enemy surface vessels. And that meant if you wanted to keep the ships with the same speed, the same range, and the same stability margins as the Le Hardy's, you would need to make these modified ships considerably larger, and that, of course, if you wanted speed, meant you'd need more powerful machinery. If the hull was going to be larger, then the armament might also be switched from 3 twin mounts, with options considered including 3 twin 130mm mounts with an additional twin 100mm, 4 twin 100mm mounts, or even 4 twin 130mm mounts. Some light armour was also considered to protect the bridge and the main battery from strafing attacks, although the increase in weight from that would cost a torpedo tube and a reduction of light anti-aircraft guns from 37 to 23mm. It was decided that the first option, adding an additional twin 100mm mount, would be the one that's constructed, with 3 out of the 4 additional Le Hardis being reordered to this specification, while the last one would be built to the original Le Hardi design, which would leave 9 original spec units in 3 units of 3. However, the fall of France curtailed these ships from being constructed. The idea was briefly resurrected in Vichy, France, to a yet again modified design, which was fractionally slower, but had a heavier medium anti-aircraft battery with considerably more 37mm guns and fewer torpedoes. But issues with the 130mm dual-purpose mountings meant that swapping them out for twin 100mm types was also considered. But this plan didn't get very far before the Germans decided they were taking over the rest of France anyway in 1942, bringing an end to French destroyer development until the T-47 class after World War II. The other side of French design, the contre-torpilleurs, had seen their lineage end considerably earlier. Just before World War II, it was decided to build a third Mogador class, as the Marine Nationals, you might have guessed by now, liked to operate their destroyers in 3-ship formations, but then to follow it up with another 3 improved ships, often termed the Klebers after the proposed lead ship's name. These would aim first to have longer range and better agility than the Mogadors. That latter wouldn't be too difficult to achieve, as some battleships were more agile than the Mogadors. The most obvious change was swapping out the aft torpedo tubes for a pair of twin 100mm anti-aircraft guns and a few more heavy machine guns, which would serve in the same role. Since the ships would now only have one set of torpedo tubes, provision was also made to carry a few reloads. However, this added weight up high on the ship overall, as well as ongoing issues with the heavy 138.6mm main guns, also led to proposals to switch them to the same 130mm dual-purpose mountings that were being considered for the follow-on Le Hardis. Everything paused when World War II broke out, with work briefly restarting in spring 1940, leading to more changes. Switching to 130mm dual-purpose guns was confirmed, and the 100mm guns were therefore deleted and replaced by an array of 37mm guns, with ideas to develop this redesign still further with a program tentatively titled Type 1940, but with the fall of France a couple of months later, all work on these ships was stopped and was never restarted. That brings us, briefly, onto the Soviet Union. Pretty much their entire World War II destroyer story was various attempts to finish ships that were already on the slipways when the war began, and therefore those are ships that were covered in the previous video. But there was one program of new ships. These resulted from the natural effects of declaring actual qualifications in ship design and construction to be a bourgeoisie concept, and then executing or exiling a bunch of those who had such paperwork as enemies of the state. Specifically in this case, the original idea had been to take the Tashkent, which had been mostly built in Italy, and build another 3 such ships in Soviet yards. Except it turned out that building a big, capable and complex destroyer like Tashkent with what was left of the Soviet shipbuilding industry after the most recent purges was pretty much impossible. So this idea was cancelled, and they instead decided they were going to try and build a smaller vessel. Although at just under 2,400 ton standard displacement, it was still going to be a fairly substantial destroyer, but then, in a complete 4D chess move, they also decided to try and fit an even heavier armament than the Tashkent on a considerably smaller hull, while somehow maintaining Tashkent's blisteringly high top speed. More specifically, they kept the 3 twin 130mm guns in the main armament, but decided to add a pair of 76mm anti-aircraft guns, and swapped the 3 triple torpedo launchers for 2 quintuple torpedo launchers, which is a net gain of 1 torpedo. They also hoped, believe it or not, to build 30 of these ships, but only 15 were ordered, and 3 of those were laid down before the Germans invaded. This meant that one of them was scrapped on the slipway, and the other two were launched in a very incomplete state and then towed away from the front lines, where they stayed for the rest of the war. Officially dubbed Project 48, a revised Project 48K design was drawn up after the war, which at least acknowledged the need for a larger hull to fit this armament, but this project also didn't progress and the hulls were instead used as targets. The resulting class is sometimes known as the Kiev class. Projects 35 and 40, other large destroyers with dual-purpose main guns, were drawn up in the middle of the war, but they never progressed to even having a keel plate laid, so you can just mention those in passing. That brings us to the Regia Marina. They just started in on the Soldati class before the war began, which, with its pair of twin 120mm gun mounts and 2 triple torpedo launchers, was pretty much in keeping with the design lineage that had started out with the Navigatores years earlier, albeit exact displacement and top speed of the intervening Italian destroyers had varied somewhat along the way. However, a second batch of Soldatis were laid down during the war, which did reflect a few changes. The short-barreled 120mm Star Shell-only gun amidships was replaced by a fifth full-size 120mm gun, and the anti-aircraft battery was upgraded from heavy machine guns to a large number of 20mm cannon. Some ships of both batches would also have their aft torpedo tubes replaced by 37mm anti-aircraft guns, and radar was also brought in on some ships as a mid-war modification. The plan was to supersede them with a larger type, the Comandante Medaglie d'Oro class, which pushed displacement over the 2,000-ton mark to 2,100-ton standard. This was primarily designed to buy increased range and better sustained top speed. Previous Italian destroyers had often had very high sprint speeds on trials and occasionally in service, but it turned out they couldn't sustain them in the long term. The main armament remained at 4 guns, which was common to pretty much all Italian destroyer designs at the time, but these were upscaled to 135mm or 5.3-inch guns, and would now be mounted singly instead of in a pair of twin mounts. But Italy would become unique in the major navies for not embracing dual-purpose main armament. The new emplacements could elevate to 45 degrees, which would allow them to provide a degree of cover to other ships, much like the 4.7-inch guns found on the British Tribal class, but they couldn't defend themselves with these guns, except against maybe torpedo bombers. Instead, anti-aircraft defence was to come from a dozen single 37mm guns, with the Italian standard 2 triple torpedo launchers providing anti-ship firepower. A modified design was prepared for a second batch of ships which added another 135mm mount aft, and consolidated the light and medium anti-aircraft guns into a pair of quad 37mm guns and another pair of quad 20mm mounts. With sonar and radar also installed, these ships might be seen as broadly similar to the Fletcher class, but with the first ship not laid down until the end of 1942, none got even close to completion before the Italian armistice in 1943. And thus we move on to the Germans. We left them having laid down the Type 1936A destroyers. Wartime-only production for major destroyers would thus start with the second batch of this design. These differed from the originals in being a little larger overall, having a revised power plant that didn't break down quite as often, and actually mostly being completed with the original planned armament of 1 twin and 3 single 150mm or 5.9-inch guns. Although this wasn't necessarily to their benefit, as even the earlier models with 4 single 150mm guns found that this often caused stability and seakeeping issues, which are obviously worse when you stuck the additional weight of an extra gun on the front. They were superseded in turn by the Type 1936Bs, which by now were unhelpfully being laid down in 1941 and not 1936. These are essentially the Type 1936As, but with a revised main armament, appreciating by this point the ridiculous weight and stability penalties of trying to give an admittedly large destroyer a similar main battery as that found on light cruisers well over twice their displacement. The Type 1936Bs instead went back to the 127mm or roughly 5-inch gun in 5 single mounts. Unfortunately, their anti-aircraft firepower was practically non-existent. The main guns were not dual-purpose. The 37mm medium anti-aircraft guns were the awful bolt-action single-shot SKC-30 types, and although there were no less than 15 20mm cannon in 3 quad and 3 single mounts, these shorter-range weapons were generally only capable of engaging aircraft after they'd dropped their bombs or launched their torpedoes. 3 out of the 8 ships planned did actually enter service. Given that, it should thus come as no surprise that the Type 1936C never entered service. These, again, used the same basic hull design with some minimal alterations, but aimed for slightly higher top speed and a heavier main battery, using twin mounts for the 127mm or 5-inch guns, with a plan to put one forward and a pair superfiring aft for a total of 6 guns. This was to be a mostly dual-purpose weapon, although sources differ on its maximum potential elevation, with some saying 52 degrees and others 60 degrees, either of which would offer a degree of self-defense capability, but not as much as some of the better dual-purpose weapons available in other navies. These improvements, which included machinery from abandoned cruisers from the Z plan, would push standard displacement over 2,600 tons, and another 1,000 tons was added by the time it was fully loaded. But although 2 out of the 5 destroyers were laid down, none of them actually got to the launch stage. The last full-size German destroyer design was the Type 1942, of which only one was ever built, although it too would not enter service. This represented a major shift in German destroyer design. Displacement dropped considerably back to around 2,000 tons standard, with armament initially also reduced to 4 single 127mm or 5-inch guns. But a series of design revisions quickly pushed this back up to 3 twins, as per the Type 1936Cs. Due to the limited nature of these weapons for anti-aircraft self-defense, light and medium anti-aircraft batteries were also changed to brand new 30mm and 55mm weapons, respectively. But the single largest change was a switch from steam turbine to diesel propulsion. This would result in a slight loss of speed, but give more than double the operational range, giving it similar endurance to some of the shorter-ranged battleships still around in the world at the time. But the lone example, the Z-51, was bombed and sunk shortly before the end of the war while she was still fitting out. There were, of course, also the German torpedo boats, but given that they displaced as much or more than some actual destroyers, we do kind of have to cover them, albeit somewhat briefly. The approximately 1,300-ton Type 1939 or Elbing class carried 4 single 105mm or 4.1-inch guns, along with a pair of triple torpedo launchers. Much like other small German ships in the late 1930s and early 1940s, their power plants were a bit of a disappointment, prone to breakdown, slightly underpowered, and very inefficient. Nonetheless, 15 ships were completed, although many more had been planned, and they saw significant active service in the Baltic and North Seas, the English Channel, and off the western coast of France. But with much activity came many losses, and 11 out of the 15 would be lost, mostly to mines and in surface actions. Only 2 were lost to air attack, and both of those were sunk late in the war, possibly because, although small, their main armament was actually dual-purpose, which, when combined with a scattering of 20mm guns, gave them some respectable anti-aircraft firepower for their size. There were also some bolt-action 37mm around, mostly for entertainment purposes. The plan was for the next class, the Type 1940s, to abandon the pretense of torpedo boat entirely. Projected at over 1,900 tons standard displacement, they were destroyers by pretty much any definition. They were to be armed with 2 quad torpedo launchers and 4 single 127mm or 5-inch guns, plus light and medium anti-aircraft weapons. They were actually a bit of a hasty design, being very rapidly thrown together after the invasion of the Netherlands to take advantage of the materials that the Dutch had assembled for their own destroyer program, and the more general perceived capacity of Dutch naval infrastructure that was now under German control. But although 24 of them were planned, and at least 8 of them were actually laid down, it turned out that telling the workforce of a country you just brutally bombed and occupied to now build warships for you was not exactly a pronouncement met with great enthusiasm, and the Dutch workers, at some risk to themselves, engineered the slowest, most protracted, and most painful building program they could possibly think of, which meant that the 4 which were actually launched took, on average, about as long to go from keel laying to launch as the substantially more motivated American workers on the other side of the Atlantic took to get an entire Iowa class from keel laying to launch. The Type 1941 torpedo boat program was more in keeping with the development line coming from the Type 1939s, though. At around 1,500 ton standard displacement and of a broadly similar armament to those earlier ships, it was hoped that more powerful and hopefully more reliable machinery would also make them a bit faster. But the pressures of war meant that of the 15 planned, the first was only laid down in summer 1943, and only 4 of the hulls reached launch status, with 3 of them surviving the war but then being scuttled by the Allies soon thereafter as of no real interest. The very last design was the Type 1944 torpedo boat. This was slightly smaller than the Type 1941, with again a similar armament except that the lighter AA guns were to be replaced by 5 twin 37mm mounts that were actually capable of firing more than one shot before needing to be reloaded, and additionally the 105mm guns were to be placed in a pair of fully dual-purpose twin mounts instead of in 4 singles. They were also supposed to be somewhat faster at 37 knots, but although they were actually ordered in the same year as their design number, this was notably late in the war and nothing further was done before the Soviets overran the shipyards that were supposed to be building them. And so we roll on to Japan, which interestingly, and almost contrary to everybody else, had decided to pretty much abandon the idea of destroyers as a general-purpose platform at the last moment. Whereas everybody else was already building general-purpose destroyers or was trending towards that category, unless exceptional circumstances demanded otherwise, such as with destroyer escorts. In this regard, the Japanese would devise 4 categories: Type A, Type B, Type C, and Type D. The Type A was about as close to a general-purpose destroyer as you were going to get. It continued the line of pre-war Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer development for fleet actions, and this was the Yugamo class. Compared to the immediately pre-war Kageros, they were broadly similar, a fraction larger and heavier, but only just, with the same speed and the same on-paper armament, except for the 2 quadruple torpedo launchers being upgraded to quintuple units. The differences were in the details. The overall shape and size of all above-deck superstructure elements was shaped for weight saving, as well as less air resistance, and thus granting the ships a bit more stability, and the 3 twin 5-inch gun mounts that made up the main armament were placed in new mountings that allowed an elevation sufficient to be counted as true dual-purpose weapons, albeit rather slow-firing and slow-tracking ones. As the war went on, they would also gain many 25mm anti-aircraft guns, either in new installations or by upgrading existing ones from twin to triple mountings, although the general effectiveness of the 25mm was such that outside of occasional lucky breaks, they were more useful for just putting it down a sheer volume of fire and trying to throw strike aircraft off their aim, or giving the fighters something to strafe that wasn't torpedoes full of pure oxygen. Of the 19 ships that were actually built, every single one would be lost, unsurprisingly about half of them to air attack. The Type B was supposed to be an exclusively anti-aircraft dedicated escort destroyer for carrier formations, with the lead, and as it turned out only, class being the Akizukis. Compared to the Yugamos, just under 2,100 ton displacement, the Akizukis were actually considerably larger at 2,700 ton standard, despite having an on-paper lighter armament of 4 twin 100mm or 3.9-inch dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns, and a single quadruple torpedo launcher, as opposed to 3 twin 5-inch guns and 2 quadruple torpedo launchers. Speed was also a little bit slower at 33 knots due to the increased size, but having the same 52,000 shaft horsepower power output. The increased size and weight was partially down to the fact that the fully dual-purpose twin mounts were, despite using smaller guns, actually a little bit heavier than even the dual-purpose 5-inch mounts on the Yugamos, and considerably heavier than the earlier, less well-elevating 5-inch mounts found on earlier destroyers. mostly because these ones could go all the way up to 90 degrees. Putting 4 of them aboard thus meant a considerably larger hull was needed to keep the ship stable. While an increasing number of 25mm were also carried as the war went on, the main strength of the ship were those extremely rapidly firing 100mm 65 caliber guns. Over 3 dozen ships were planned, of which 32 were ordered and 12 actually completed. In addition to some of them joining the war in its last year, the class as a whole proved remarkably survivable for a Japanese warship of the Second World War, with half of them actually surviving the war, and of the 6 lost, only 1, possibly 2, depending on which source you believe, were lost to air attack, and this in an environment where US air power was picking off other Japanese destroyers like it was going out of fashion. Suzutsuki in particular would survive all of 1943, 44 and 45, including a spot in Operation Tengo, the last voyage of Yamato. The class is sometimes split into 3 subclasses as 2 rounds of design simplification were enacted to speed up production, but their capabilities in terms of firepower, speed, etc. remained broadly similar. The Type C destroyer was supposed to be a pure attack craft, heavily armed with torpedoes, but in the end would be represented by a single ship, the Shimakaze, which was also larger than the Yugamos, but not quite as large as the Akazukis, coming in at just under 2,600 tons standard. She was, however, much faster, capable of around 41 knots on a good day, and although she had the same gun armament as a Yugamo, the additional size was used to buy another quintuple torpedo launcher, giving her a total launch capacity of 15. Oddly though, while the ostensibly escort-focused Akazukis often found themselves being committed to frontline attack roles, the supposedly attack-focused Shimakaze spent most of the war escorting convoys and other ship movements, with her only real offensive operation being when she was part of Center Force during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and even there she ended up acting more as a giant lifeboat for the crews of the Musashi and Maya in the aftermath of the earlier Battle of Subian Sea, which meant she saw no direct action at Samar, and she was then sunk in late 1944 by air attack. The Type A, B and C types all had planned successors, which are sometimes dubbed Super Akazuki, Super Shimakaze, or Super Yugamo, but they're more accurately described as improved versions, since that's a better translation of the Japanese term Kai, which was attached to the previous class name to describe the next generation of ships. Due to wartime pressures, most of the improvements in these classes focused on standardizing parts across all types and simplifying construction to both speed production and use fewer rare war materials. None of the Kai types were actually built for these classes, and their overall firepower and speed capabilities would have been broadly the same. That leaves the Type D destroyer. These, like the British Hunt class in the previous video and the Type 1939s in this one, are right on the edge of what you could consider being a true destroyer, and, like the Hunt class or the US destroyer escorts, were primarily designed as mass-producible convoy escorts. But 2 features land them here instead. Firstly, their top speed, at about 28 knots, was put in place because the Japanese Navy's designers wanted them to still be capable of operating with the fleet if needed, and secondly, their size, at just over 1,250 tons standard, meant they're in the ballpark at displacement of other full-on destroyers, even if those others are somewhat older ones. The Type D would be represented by 2 very similar classes. The Matsu class carried radar, sonar, and just 3 5-inch guns, a single one forward and a twin aft, plus a single quadruple torpedo launcher and lots of 25mm anti-aircraft guns, along with, of course, depth charges. While the Matsus were smaller and simpler to build than regular fleet destroyers, they were still in many ways simply scaled down from normal destroyer design, and so an even simpler ship with the same overall armament, although initially slightly fewer 25mm guns, was designed to succeed them. This Tachibana class was, like the German Type 21 and Type 23 U-boats, designed for modular mass production and did away with the use of the more expensive steels, most of the curves, and almost anything else that had complexity to it, resulting in a somewhat blocky ship that almost looks like a low polygon model from a 1990s video game. Although well over 150 of the Type D were ordered, including many to an even more simplified version of the Tachibana design, only 32 ships would be completed, 18 Matsus and 14 Tachibanas. 10 of these would be lost, with the remainder surviving largely through a combination of being purely on second-line work or just entering service in the very last year of the war. We're now down to just 2 navies, and surprisingly, the US Navy actually has a relatively short entry here. This is primarily thanks to the first entry in their wartime production list, the Fletcher class. Now, I've said much about the Fletchers elsewhere, but to briefly summarise again here, the Fletchers were some of the best designed destroyers of the time. Although far from the largest, at just over 2,000 tons standard, they combined a good top speed of just over 36 knots, with a range using steam turbines that the Germans could only match using diesels, plus an excellent all-round armament, which in the baseline model consisted of 5 single 5-inch 38 dual-purpose guns and 2 quintuple torpedo launchers. Although initially quite lacking in the light and medium anti-aircraft department, one of the key points with the Fletchers was essentially putting the same kind of armament that had been planned for the immediately preceding classes on a much larger hull. To be sure, there had been attempts to also increase the armament together with the hull size, but with a rather long record of barely stable or outright unstable designs in the 1930s to point to, this effort had been fended off. The result was a fast and powerful destroyer with good all-round defensive and offensive capabilities and an incredible margin of stability which allowed it to take a lot of upgrades, which turned out to be mostly light and medium anti-aircraft guns. Although built en masse with a total of 175 hitting the water, and thrust into the front lines of World War II, mostly in the Pacific, only 19 would be lost, with the single largest cause of loss being kamikaze attack aircraft in the latter part of the war. Prior to these attacks kicking off, only 6 had been lost, 2 to air attack and 4 in surface actions, including of course the Hoel and Johnston at the Battle of Samar. One of the keys to this ship's survivability was the decision to include a long strip of thicker STS steel along each side. While not belt armour as such, since it wasn't thick enough to stop any actual naval gunfire, it was in roughly the same place you'd find an armour belt on a larger ship, and it was strong enough to stop blast and splinter effects from near misses by bombs and shells puncturing the ship around the waterline, which was the direct or indirect cause of a considerable number of destroyer losses in many other navies during this conflict. However, as the war went on, even the Fletcher class's safety margins were being exceeded, and some ships were beginning to land their forward torpedo launchers in favour of even more anti-aircraft guns by the time the war ended. And so, after only 2 years of mass production, the last Fletcher would be laid down in late 1943 and commissioned just under a year later. Overlapping this period, but itself due for a production run of barely over a year, was its notional successor, the Allen M. Sumner class. Slightly larger and displacing about 200 tons more at 2,200 tons standard, the Sumners retained the same power plant, and as a result their speed fell off to about 34 knots. The additional size was necessitated by a switch in armament from 5 single to 3 twin 5-inch 38 dual-purpose mounts. This gave them an extra gun, which obviously itself meant more weight, but in addition, the single mounts used in the Fletchers each weighed around about 19 tons or just under, whereas the twin mounts came in at just under 44 tons apiece. And this meant that although there were fewer of them, collectively the mountings weighed considerably more. But they did occupy slightly less surface area overall, and that allowed the carriage of even more light and medium anti-aircraft guns in addition to retaining the pair of quintuple torpedo launchers. And that meant on average a Sumner might carry a couple more 40mm Bofors and several additional 20mm Oerlikons compared with the average late-war Fletcher. Late war replacement of the aft torpedo launcher with another quad Bofors only increased this anti-aircraft firepower advantage, and their other notional advantage over the Fletchers was twin rudders, which gave them greater agility being perhaps the one weakness of the Fletcher-class design. 58 were built, with another 12 planned but reordered as mine layers, which were essentially Sumners that had the mine rails instead of torpedo tubes. 4 of the Sumners were lost in action, with the class generally proving to be quite tough, as evidenced by the stand of the Sumner-class USS Laffey, which survived, albeit just, being bombed and kamikazed repeatedly during one particularly notable engagement. The reason for the short production run was the switch over to the Gearing class. These were essentially Sumners, but with an additional 14-foot hull section put amidships, which gave them more fuel storage and thus more range, which meant initially the armament was actually exactly the same, just with better fire arcs. A large 152 ship run was planned, but the end of the war saw most of these orders cancelled if they hadn't already been started, so a total of 98 would finally enter service, with some of the earliest ones arriving just in time to see out the close of the Pacific Campaign of World War II. Their main strength would be seen in the Cold War, where, like the Fletchers before them, they proved to have a considerable margin for upgrades. The ship's initial standard displacement of just over 2,600 tons was just over 400 tons more than a Sumner's, but with no additional use of deck space for armament, and this growth capacity would see some of them last in service in various navies all the way through to the early 21st century, albeit admittedly in a somewhat altered guise. That leaves us with the Royal Navy, who proved to be quite prolific in construction of various classes of destroyer, although as we'll see, quite a few of them were very similar. Back in the First World War, the Royal Navy had built numerous classes of war emergency destroyers, and this time around the same approach was taken. Although the larger L and M class destroyers showed the direction the Royal Navy had wanted to go in, it would be simpler, faster, and cheaper to use a smaller hull as the basis of what was supposed to be a bunch of mass-produced ships. Thus, the O and P classes were derived from the earlier J-class hull. The stern was slightly altered and displacement reduced, while the machinery was kept the same, which meant that the new ships would actually be a fraction faster. The biggest change visually was a reversion from 3 twin 4.7-inch guns to 4 single mountings, which also necessitated a slight reworking of the aft superstructure to incorporate the 4th mount. This was because single mounts were quicker and easier to manufacture, and 4 guns instead of 6 meant that 3 of the new ships could be armed for the production time and cost, gun-wise, of 2 of the full-scale fleet destroyers, and the saved weight could be put into more anti-submarine armament and additional anti-aircraft guns, as well as radar, which was a relatively far-sighted choice. Another advantage was that with half as many guns forward, you could use just one magazine to hold all the shells, and the other could be converted to carry more fuel, which would extend their range. In theory, since the overall hull was still similar, especially up front where it was practically unchanged, at some future point the ships could be rearmed with twin 4.7-inch guns to make them near relatives of the J-class, but in the event this never actually happened. Additional generators for backup power and electrical heating were also incorporated into the design, although the rapid growth of systems as the war went on meant that the J-class hull would soon prove to be a little bit cramped for later iterations of this war emergency type. In theory, the O and P class were designed to have 3 interchangeable armament fits, which could be hot swapped in port. 4 guns and 4 depth charge launchers, 3 guns and 8 depth charge launchers, or 3 guns, 4 depth charge launchers, and a minesweeping apparatus known as the 2-speed destroyer sweep, or TSDS, which was designed to be able to be used at high speeds, as normal minesweeping gear could only be used at low speeds. In theory, this would all be supplemented by a pair of torpedo launchers, although these would be quadruple launchers as compared to the quintuple launchers on the J-class and other fleet destroyers. However, initial shortages of supplies and a desire for rapid construction meant that the O's and P's would enter service with a slightly confusing array of weapons. Some had 4 single 4-inch guns instead of the 4.7s, but they kept the 2 torpedo launchers. Others had four 4.7s, but put a 4-inch gun in place of the aft torpedo launcher, since the 4.7s lacked decent elevation for dual-purpose use, and still others had one torpedo launcher and 5 4-inch guns, with, again, the 5th gun taking the place of the aft torpedo launcher. The 4.7-inch at this stage couldn't really be used for self-defense against aerial targets. It only had a 40-degree elevation, which meant at best it could be used to defend other ships. And that was largely the reason for the 4-inch, because that was a fully anti-aircraft capable weapon. All of the vessels also carried a quad 40mm pom-pom and a variety of 20mm Oerlikons. In the next batch, the Q and R classes, some simplification was enacted, with steel replacing aluminium in the superstructure to allow the latter material to be used in aircraft production. The hull was allowed to grow slightly, becoming more akin to the N class in size, although the overall form was still based on the J class. This accommodated the slight overall increase in top weight. These ships steadied out the armament layout, having 4 single 4.7-inch guns, a quad pom-pom, some Oerlikons, and 2 quadruple torpedo launchers, the R-class displacing a fraction more than the Qs owing to having a slightly heavier anti-submarine loadout and also being fitted to operate in tropical waters. The R-class would also be fitted for, but not with an aim to later refit them, the same gun mounting that the next set, the S and T classes, would have, namely a 4.7-inch gun with a higher elevation. Granted, this was only to 55 degrees, so it was still not truly dual-purpose, but it was better than nothing, and the use of the J-class hull meant that the heavier mounting was quite easily installed on a supporting structure that had originally been designed to support a twin mount. Anti-aircraft armament also changed, with 8 instead of 6 Oerlikons, and the quadruple pom-pom replaced by a pair of twin stabilised 40mm Bofors. HMS Savage would be fitted with an alternate armament, an experimental set of 4.5-inch guns, 2 in a twin mount forward, and 2 in singles aft. Although the former mount, the twin mount, was recognisable as a somewhat modified pancake turret as found on British capital ships. The idea was to test the effectiveness of the 4.5-inch gun as a true dual-purpose gun in destroyers, with a view to the ongoing development of the next stage of proposed true fleet destroyers, which we'll come back to later. During the development of these first 3 pairs of classes, there was also an ongoing argument over the ship's main guns. Some were pressing for 4 twin 4-inch instead. This was usually shot down on the grounds of, yes, it would provide great anti-aircraft cover, but potentially considerably less effectiveness in the anti-surface role. There were also discussions about simply purchasing US 5-inch 38s instead, but it turned out that the US gun, at least as advertised to the British, needed more space and weight due to the presence of a handling room below the mount, whereas the British guns simply passed ammunition straight up from the magazines. Delays trying to work out how to fit a decent number of 5-inch 38s into the British hulls, which was slightly longer but narrower than similar displacement American ships, meant that by the time some design solution were available, Japan had already attacked Pearl Harbor, and outside of arming the cruiser HMS Delhi, the US would not provide any more 5-inch 38 guns for export in the near future, as they needed them all for their own purposes. The T-class would also see the pole masts of previous ships replaced with a lattice mast, which was better able to support the increasing array of radar, electronic warfare, electronic countermeasure, and radio equipment that a modern destroyer needed. These would then be followed by the U and V class, which were essentially similar, except for minor changes to the bridge structure and the introduction of twin rather than single 20mm Oerlikons. The pattern continued with the next set, the W and Z classes, and bear in mind that all of these classes had been laid down in an approximately 3-year period from early 1940 to now in 1943. The W class would be the last to use the 4.7-inch gun, as the Z class introduced the 4.5-inch, which, although being fractionally smaller, was actually a more powerful and faster-firing weapon. Although for now, it was simply swapped into the same 55-degree elevation mountings as the old 4.7-inch guns. Due to wartime shortages, many of these more recent classes had quite a mixed variety of light and medium anti-aircraft weapons. Some had Bofors, some had pom-poms, some had single Oerlikons, some had twins, and occasionally there would be a single Bofors or pom-pom stuck on when nothing else was available. Having now run out of letters in the alphabet, the next batch, mostly laid down in 1943 with the exception of Caprice, Cambrian and Karen, decided that they were going to go with names beginning with C. Quite why A and B were skipped isn't entirely clear, but they also got a little bit picky as this class was divided into 4 subclasses and the names all started still with C, but the 4 subclasses are distinguished by starting with CA, CH, CO and CR respectively. There was also going to be a CE subclass, but that got cancelled. The CAs were essentially just Z class with very minor alterations, but the other 3 introduced a brand new anti-aircraft fire control system and fully powered mountings for the 4.5-inch guns. This increased displacement to the point that one of the torpedo launchers had to be left off. The last few of this run also abandoned riveted construction completely in favour of all welding, whereas in previous destroyers there'd been a mix of rivets and welds. While all this had been going on, the Royal Navy had also been looking at what it wanted from the next generation of true fleet destroyers. Lessons of the war and from various tests, such as the one on Savage, had helped with this, but it had quite soon been realised that a true modern fleet destroyer would be considerably larger than what could fit in many of the slipways of the yards that had traditionally built such ships for the Royal Navy. And so they decided to proceed with a 2-phase programme. A true modern design, and a slightly smaller one which would be tailored to the maximum size that the smaller slipways could handle. The latter one would be designated the Weapon class. Due to the constraints of the building facilities, it ended up not being all that much longer than an emergency flotilla ship, but it was wider and deeper, resulting in an overall displacement of just under 2,000 tons standard. The continued use of the 40,000 shaft horsepower power plant meant that speed would drop on these ships, but this was considered acceptable since they would likely be kept as close screens in a fleet, and they were still more than fast enough for this purpose. And the machinery was now laid out in an alternating unit pattern, which would enhance survivability. Larger fuel tanks meant a decent 5,000 nautical mile range, but the weapon setup was an odd compromise. Trying to fit a full fleet destroyer's torpedo armament, i.e. a pair of quintuple torpedo launchers, plus the latest in anti-submarine technology, which were Squid anti-submarine mortars, plus a decent medium anti-aircraft fit of 40mm Bofors, plus a decent main battery for surface and air engagements, proved to be essentially impossible. The main guns were therefore changed from the planned pair of twin 4.5-inch to first 3 twin 4-inch, and then just 2 twin 4-inch, and these would be mounted super-firing forward, with the entire aft of the ship devoted to anti-submarine and anti-aircraft weapons as well as the torpedoes. Although this was the best that could be done given the pressure to start building, it wasn't entirely satisfactory, and a follow-up class tentatively labelled G class, with a pair of twin 4.5-inch, one mounted fore and one aft, with other weapons appropriately rearranged, were on the drawing board, but these would be cancelled at the end of 1945. This leaves us with the last ship we're looking at in this video. The Battle class were drawn up actually slightly before the Weapon class, as their sheer size was the driver that caused the Weapon class to be authorised. These ships would be even larger than the Tribal class, and would initially displace just over 2,300 tons standard. In view of the increased threat of air attack, they were to be armed with twin 4.5-inch guns in true dual-purpose mounts, which, as we've seen, would end up being prototyped on HMS Savage. The initial sketches had actually been drawn up in the aftermath of the Norwegian campaign right near the start of the war. Due to the increased size of the ship, the machinery would have to be upped in power by 10,000 shaft horsepower to a total of 50,000 to allow them to keep up a reasonable speed. And after a survey of the bipedal attack dogs that comprised most of the Royal Navy's destroyer captains, indicated that if a heavier dual-purpose mount required fewer guns overall, they would prefer that these should all be up front, since that was the direction the enemy was going to be in. And so it was decided to arm the ships with 2 twin 4.5-inch mounts, super-firing forward, and no main guns aft. A pair of quadruple torpedo launchers were included, along with depth charges, but the aft of the ship was dominated by medium anti-aircraft guns, with no less than 4 twin 40mm Bofors and up to half a dozen single Bofors. But the stabilised twin 40mm mountings were actually quite heavy, which is what precluded installing any more 4.5-inch guns aft. But at the same time, it was realised that in a night action, if they chose to use star shells instead of or as a supplement to radar, if they used the main guns for this, it would cut the ship's firepower by half, which was unacceptable. So a small 4-inch star shell gun was installed aft as well. This would be the majority of the 1942 battle class design, but after some further feedback, it was decided to make the ship a little bit more suited for a surface action. While the Norwegian campaign had emphasised the threat of air power, subsequent operations in the Mediterranean and the early part of the Pacific campaign had pointed out that vicious close-range surface actions were still very definitely on the cards. This would push the 1943 batch of battle class up to almost 2,500 tons standard, with the single 4-inch aft replaced by a single full-scale 4.5-inch, which gave a total of 5 guns and meant there was some aft coverage. In addition, one of the twin 40mm Bofors and some of the single mounts were removed, and the torpedo launchers were upgraded from quadruple launchers to quintuple, or in British terms, pentad sets instead. There was also a Squid anti-submarine mortar installed from the beginning, whereas with the 1942 batch they'd started out with depth charges and then had to be retrofitted. Although laid down in 1942 and 1943, priority being placed on the emergency flotilla ships, which were faster to build, and a shortage of fire control equipment and radar, meant that only the lead ship, HMS Barfleur, commissioned in time to see just a little bit of service in the Pacific right before the end of the war. Design work would begin in 1944 for what was tentatively labelled as either Battle Class Batch 3 or 1944 Battle Class, which revived an idea that had been briefly floated in the 1943 design to install a third full twin 4.5-inch mount aft. But to fit enough Bofors, the torpedo tubes, the Squid launchers, and 3 twin 4.5-inch guns on a hull that could actually go at any appreciable speed required a considerably larger ship, and the arguments that were caused by the apparent size of the new vessel meant that the resulting class of destroyers, the Darings, wouldn't be laid down until just after World War II ended, which thus puts them outside the scope of this video. So, there you have it, a relatively speaking brief outline of destroyer developments during World War II in the major navies. Now, of course, this does leave a very small number of primarily gun-based destroyers, which is what the channel covers, out of the running. The Darings, the Norfolks, Mitchers and Forrest Shermans, the T-47 and T-43 designs, the Impetuoso, and the Scori, Nestroshimi and Kotlin classes. So if you'd like me to do perhaps a slightly shorter video that covers those last gun destroyers in the future, let me know in the comments.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.